Real pleasure to get a chance to come and talk to you about some of the work that we've done in the region, which also includes Rainy Lake. It was related to a project. Well, I'll give you the preamble in a second, but most of the focus of what we're going to talk about today, there's other things too, but the majority of the focus is going to be looking at the impacts of Spiny Water Flea, which are these guys here. Also, the scientific name being Bithytrophes, they're not this big, I promise. But if anyone's ever been out down rigging for lake trout on the lake, around this time of year, maybe between July and August, and if you see a little clump of like stuff on the line or on your downrigger, it's probably a bunch of these with the spines all stuck to the downrigger. They've been in Rainy Lake since about 2006, and really all through the region since about the mid to late 1980s. They've all started moving inland from the Great Lakes, and where people just sort of thought their impacts traditionally stopped at zooplankton, and who really cares about zooplankton? We're starting to get a better sense of their impacts on fisheries, and that's going to be a bit of the focus of the talk today. So I would be remiss if I got any further than to recognize the people that have done most of the actual work that I'm going to talk about today, and that's the awesome grad students that I've had in my lab. So Marianne Geisler, who was my first graduate student at the University of Manitoba. We've got some of her work in here. The two people that were on the work that was funded to look at the most recent work are Jenny Gartshore on the far right there, and Ben Wood in the orange tube down here. They did a lot of the work on Quetico and used the data from Rainy Lake. And then Alex Ross, who's a current PhD student in the lab, looking to finish up pretty soon. Okay, so here's a bit of the outline for what I'm going to talk about today. So we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of walleye, both nationally and regionally. Convince you, I'm sure this group doesn't need convincing, but walleye are pretty important. We'll talk a little bit about what we know some of the variables are that influence the growth, abundance, and sustainability of walleye, all things that are really important from a management perspective. And then we're going to switch gears a little bit to talk about influences of contaminant levels on walleye. So unlike a lot of species like muskie or something like that, where people like to catch the fish and take a photo and put them back, lots of people catch walleye and bring them home for dinner. So contaminant concentrations, particularly for this species, can be something worthwhile paying attention to. And then once we talk a little bit about that, we're really going to focus on what the impacts of these invasive species, particularly spiny water flea, are on mercury levels and how growth sort of plays into that as well. And then I'll wrap it up with a quick slide on what that might mean for Rainy Lake populations. Okay, so walleye and inland lakes in particular. So not thinking about Lake Erie or anything like that, but we are including Lake Winnipeg in this. So they're important both recreationally and commercially. If you look, so DFO does a survey once every 5 years to look at recreational fishing. But in the most recent iteration that's publicly available, about 70% of the anglers in Ontario are reporting walleye as their target species. So that's a lot of people are going out and fishing for walleye, when they're going out and fishing. From a commercial perspective, if we look at the landed value, so I am including Great Lakes here, it's about $50 million US annually. The inland commercial value, and this is mostly Lake Winnipeg, is going to be about $20 million a year. There's a few sort of odds and sods from smaller lakes that northern communities fish. But the combined sort of knock-on effects of all of that is worth it's hundreds of millions of dollars in extended benefits to Ontario. So it's not just catching the fish that generates money, it's all the boats and all the fishing gear and everything else that we buy and the tour operators that we pay and all that sort of stuff that really generates the economics here. So it's a changing resource. So I'm sure anyone that's been fishing for walleye for a while can recognize that things go up, things go down. But in many studies, we look, and there's been a lot of work coming out of Wisconsin on this recently. Many studies indicating declines in abundance and growth of walleye in those regions, like northern U.S., sort of Minnesota, Wisconsin. And also some hints starting to look at increases in contaminants in this species. And for something that we tend to come home and bring on our dinner plates, that's an important thing to consider. Right. And the thing that I'm hopefully going to convince you about today is that it's not often just like, oh yeah, it's climate change. Oh yeah, it's overfishing. The drivers of change in these species are often multifaceted and often interrelated amongst various components, which can make it hard to tease apart. So what are some common things that we point to for changes in walleye populations specifically? I'm not going to talk a lot about this today, but overharvest is an obvious one. And I think we often find that this is one of those sort of levers that we're able to pull quite easily as resource managers, right? So the population's going down. Let's have everyone just chill out a bit and leave it alone for a couple of years and things will come back. And so I won't say much more about that, other than to point out, I found a great slide picture here from a recent thing on the Rainy River close by anyway, where some guys got busted in November 2021, 48 fish over the limit. So I guess they didn't read the regs very carefully. Anyway, those all got confiscated along with the coolers. Some other factors that we want to think about. So what drives sort of walleye life histories generally? One thing that we can look at is climate. So this is work that was done by a colleague of mine, Paul Venturelli. Used to be at University of Minnesota. He's now down at Ball State in Ohio. But this stemmed out of his PhD work. And what you can find is that, so got growing degree days here on the x-axis. So think of that as just ambient temperature, okay, over a certain temperature. And what we can see is that as generally air temperatures increase, we see the growth rate of walleye tends to increase also. And you could replace on this axis, you could replace latitude with this, and it would be about the same thing. So if we're in colder environments, young walleye take longer to reach maturity. In warmer environments, so like southern Minnesota or something like that, they hit maturity a lot faster. Okay, those early growth rates can really just depend on temperature. But there's an interesting interaction here. One of the things about walleye is, I mean, the reason that we call them walleye is they've got that sort of shiny eye thing going on, right? So they've got the same structure in there as like your cat. So it's a reflective surface, so they can actually see well in low light levels. And so light is another really important environmental driver of walleye. And some recent work that's come out of Minnesota has showed that this relationship, right, this relationship of increasing temperature generating more rapid growth in young walleye is actually modulated by water clarity. So this is SETI depth down here. That's just a measure of how clear the water is. And we can see that the more clear the water is, the less of an impact temperature can have. So it's almost, we can think of water clarity at some point taking over in terms of this relationship beyond what temperature's doing. So what are some other things that are important? Nutrients are really important, right? Up to a point, the more nutrients we dump into a lake will cause fish to grow faster and get bigger. An interesting story about that is this looks at the commercial production of walleye in Lake Winnipeg. Okay, these lines here, there's a different story here, but these lines here are three different estimates of what maximum sustainable yield should be in Lake Winnipeg. So how much fish you should be able to take out without impacting the ecosystem. And things sort of bounce around there. They really take off after in the early 2000s. They're way above what we should be harvesting. And the interesting part about that increase in yield is that It's about 4 years after the major flood event that we had in Winnipeg in 1997. So what happened with that flood event is that we got all sorts of nutrients off the land. That all those nutrients went up in a walleye, and we got a huge boon of walleye. Should we have been harvesting that much? That's a different question. But a clear sign that nutrients can have a positive impact on walleye abundance. Similarly, work by others in inland lakes has shown that as phosphorus levels decrease, we see decreases in the abundance of walleye. But this also gets us back to water clarity, because when you increase the nutrients in an ecosystem, you often also reduce the water clarity, right? More nutrients means more algae, decreased water clarity. But guess what? Walleye really like dark lakes. So there's a bit of an interaction here. This is work by Marianne Geisler on the top panel showing that when you get a change in the water clarity in a lake, depending on where you are on this sort of magic 2 meter point, which is, we could get into a bit later, but if you're in a very dark lake and your water clarity increases, you can actually lose walleye production. Is that right? Yeah. But if you're in a very clear lake and it starts to get darker, you can actually increase your walleye production. And this is also from that other slide where I was looking at changes in phosphorus over time with walleye production. So I should have pointed this out earlier. I didn't. The triangles here are walleye catch per unit effort. This is, in this case, water clarity. On the previous slide, it was total phosphorus. It doesn't really matter, but the point is they go together, right? When one goes down, so does the other. So in this case, where we had, in the previous example, where we had phosphorus going down and walleye production going down, you have the same thing with water clarity. So there are a lot of these variables are intertwined and difficult to tease apart. Okay, so what about invasive species? Lots of people have looked at impacts of invasive species on walleye. I'm going to go through these fish examples pretty quick, just to say that when we've looked at it through a scientific lens, despite a lot of anecdotal or like gut feelings, when we look for an impact of smelt on walleye, we don't really see it as much as we think we should, right? You've got all these like little offshore things swimming around that never used to be in there. Walleye growth should be off the charts, and when you look at this over several different ecosystems, we just don't see a consistent effect. There does seem to be a potentially negative interaction with bass. Also, I'm not sure where all these arrows are coming from, but I don't know. It's
curious to get someone trying to get into this.
Oh, do you?
Oh,
I don't.
Anyway, sorry.
It's a
fast. I don't know. It's my racing stripes on my slides, and yes. Anyway, there do seem to be some potentially negative interactions between bass. So smallmouth bass have sort of been kind of on this northward invasion front, and we seem to indicate that there's that bass can have a negative impact on walleye. Zebra mussels, it really seems to depend, right? Like it's tied into this water clarity issue. I'll spend one slide on that. And then I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about Spiny Water Flea today. So here's that zebra mussel thing. So I brought you this slide on an earlier slide when I was talking about water clarity. What I didn't tell you is that the goal of this research was to try and understand how walleye would respond to the amount of water clarity change that we might see in a lake due to zebra mussel invasion. Okay, and yeah, the story's the same. It depends on where you are around this 2 meter mark. If the water is getting, let's see here. So if the water clarity increases between 0 to 2 meters, you might expect walleye production to go down. Am I getting this right? Yeah. And then if your water clarity, so there's much bigger changes. Sorry, that's the way to say this. There's much bigger changes on this side of the water clarity spectrum, where we're going from very dark lakes to much clearer lakes in terms of the amount of change that you're expecting to see. If you're in a clear lake state, and you go and water clarity increases from say 4 to 6 meters or 6 to 10 meters or something like that, we don't expect to see big changes in walleye. But if we're in very dark waters and they're becoming clearer, that's where we expect to see our impacts on walleye due to changes in water clarity. Okay, so let's talk about spiny water flea as an invasive species. So these guys were initially introduced to the Great Lakes through ballast water. So ships coming in from Europe, they would bring in water as ballast to sort of make sure they don't sink or get tossed over in the middle of the ocean, and then discharge that ballast water in the Great Lakes. Well, what we weren't all thinking about at the time is that when you discharge that water, you're discharging all the organisms that are in that water. And so that's how Bithytrophes originally got in here. There's a great paper by a colleague, Rob Kulati, when he was a grad student at the University of Windsor, where they were able to use the genetics of these guys to show exactly where they came from in Europe, which was kind of cool. Anyway, so this is sort of their current distribution, more or less. But you can see how a lot of the occurrences of these guys are really spreading out from that Great Lakes basin. And how do they move? Well, like I said, they get caught up on your downriggers and stuff. They get stuck in your ballast or your bilge water of your boats. And if you go from point A to point B, it's easy to transport these guys. The other kicker, too, is that they produce resting eggs. So most of the times they're parthenogenic. So like one individual just makes more identical copies of itself. But when they do get around to having sex, which is usually in a stressful environment, they'll produce these resting eggs. And those resting eggs can go through all sorts of, they can get dried out, they can do all sorts of things. And when they're deposited into a new ecosystem, they'll produce new babies that, because they've now recombined genetically, there's an opportunity to adapt to new systems there. So this is why there's all this stress on like cleaning your boats between water bodies and that sort of stuff, is making sure that we don't spread things that are really well adapted to spreading from one lake to another. And what do we know about the impacts of these guys? We know that they have a big impact on restructuring the zooplankton community and changing the biodiversity and abundance of zooplankton. And you may not care about zooplankton necessarily, but the important thing to keep in mind about zooplankton is that it's fish food. And even for walleye, it's fish food at very early life stages. So we'll get into that a little bit later. But here's some work that's been done by Gretchen Hansen and others down at the University of Minnesota. Some really neat work to look at how, so if you went out and collected a whole bunch of young and year walleye from a zillion lakes in Wisconsin, this is what you would find. You would find that lakes that aren't invaded by anything, at the end of the season, their length is about up here. In ones where they're invaded by Bithytrophes or zebra mussels, or even both, those growth rates, those end of season sizes are much smaller. So they're not getting as big at the end of the season as in these uninvaded lakes. And why is that important? Well, if you're not big enough at the end of the season, you have to be able to survive over winter, right? And if you're not big enough, the chances of that survival go down pretty dramatically. One other thing I want to touch on before we get into it is mercury contamination. And why do we care about that? So mercury poisoning in humans, it actually has the name Minamata disease. This comes from a major release of mercury in Japan that caused all sorts of people to die and have neurological issues. We see it much closer to home here on the Canadian side with Grassy Narrows First Nation. I'm sure if anyone's heard the horrific stories about what the impact of people have been there from the old Dryden pulp and paper plants and chloralkali plants that are associated up there. It's pretty devastating. They've actually just launched lawsuits against the provincial and federal government around this. Good for them. When we think about mercury, we have to think that it's not just industrial pollution. It's not always just there's a plant dumping in tons of mercury. This stuff just falls out of the air. Okay, and a large source of this is from burning coal. We burn coal, that mercury goes up in the atmosphere, it travels globally, and then it comes down in rain. But much the same that acid rain used to be an issue. And in the US, it was great. The EPA put in regulations back under the Obama administration to make sure we were putting scrubbers up in coal-fired power plants to make sure we were reducing those mercury impacts. All of that legislation and those scrubbers got reversed with the initial Trump administration. I'm not sure if it ever got reversed again with the Biden administration, but anyway, we'll see where that all goes. And that's all I'm going to say about that. So, what drives mercury in fish? So, we know that we've got mercury raining down on us from coal-fired power plants and from other forms of fossil fuel combustion. What do we know about what mercury does in fish? Well, generally, if we catch a big fish, it's going to have more mercury. Okay? It's a good rule of thumb. If you look at consumption advisories in Ontario for fish, and I think they've got similar stuff in Minnesota as well, basically, there will be kind of size slots, and it's like you can see as the size slot increases, the amount of fish you should eat each week goes down. Okay? So bigger fish, more mercury. And it's often because small fish are eating tiny things, big fish are eating big things, other fish, and that sort of stuff, which all have more mercury in. Growth actually plays an important role here. And if anyone's read anything in the contaminant literature, you may have heard the term growth dilution. I'm just gonna, there is no such thing, but that's okay. We're gonna instead talk about growth efficiency. So what does that mean? So imagine we've got a big walleye here. It eats two herring, two nice great big Cisco in the lake. And this sort of represents the amount of mercury that goes into this fish. So it didn't have to spend a whole lot of energy to get those two fish because it's like two big balls of food right there. And that ends up with, let's call that 1 ppm of mercury in here. Same amount, like this amount of mercury, but in a big fish, okay? Down here, you've got a fish that had to work much harder because it had to eat 4 of these perch and swim around and actually capture those perch, spend all that energy to get those perch. It accumulated the same amount of mercury, but it burned a whole lot more energy to get it, okay? So same amount of mercury in these two fish, but because this one's bigger and this one's smaller, it ends up with more mercury, okay? So there's this notion of growth efficiency, and the amount of energy you have to spend to get resources can have a direct effect on how much you have in you in terms of contaminants, right? And that'll become important a bit later. The other thing that affects mercury in food webs is your trophic position. So what you eat, you are what you eat, I guess is the idea, right? So if you're a little zooplankton, you tend to not have a whole lot of mercury, but if you're a fish that eats zooplankton, you might have more. And if you're a fish that eats zooplankton, you're up here. And if you're a fish that eats zooplankton, you might be up even higher, right? So depending on what you're eating, that can also increase your mercury. The main reason for that is that you can't really eliminate it once you get it, or those elimination rates are so slow that they might as well be zero. So whatever you bring in sort of sticks with you. And so in the context of Bithytrophes invasion, we can sort of think just from this sort of trophic position framework, what should happen if you get a zooplankton, Bithytrophes come in that eats other zooplankton? Well, let's see. So if that's what a food web looks like before Bithytrophes, okay? You've got lake herring eating zooplankton and walleye that eat lake herring. And then the Bithytrophes come in. And then once they start eating the zooplankton, we expect that that's going to elevate both the trophic position and the mercury concentration of lake herring. And then we'd see the exact same thing in walleye. Makes sense, right? The problem is, if you go out into the scientific literature and you start reading and you start collecting all sorts of papers and you look at what is happening to contaminant concentrations in fish after the invasion of Bithytrophes, we see very little Very little evidence for this. There's like one case with a small increase looking at Minnesota lakes and also in southern Wisconsin, but very little evidence. Some evidence in Lake Whitefish, but it's one species out of the whole food web, so not very convincing. And so we asked why. Like, why aren't we seeing what our expectation should be, given that it's sort of based on sound and scientific theory? Well, I think it's that the role of food web change may be minor relative to other environmental drivers in the system, and that things maybe are a little bit more nuanced and complicated than we're considering currently. And as an example, I'll show this figure. This is looking at, so this is coming from work that my PhD student Alex Ross is doing. I don't want to belabor this graph too much, but all these different colors represent lakes with different trophic complexity. So a class one would be, say, this is all lake trout. So lake trout in a lake with nothing but zooplankton to eat. But class 3 lake would be lake trout lake where they've got lake herring and freshwater shrimp and all sorts of other great stuff. So based on that last slide, our expectation is that the longer that food chain, the more mercury we should see in those fish. And we don't really see that for lake trout. Instead, what we see is that size, body size is an important driver, the length of the fish. We see that water clarity is an important driver, right? So this is clear lakes. These are dark lakes. So if you're at the same trophic position, same body size, your mercury is much higher in a dark lake than in a clear lake. So all of a sudden, food web complexity doesn't seem so important. That's for lake trout. But anyway, to stress the point, we need to be looking at several different factors here in terms of trying to understand what the underlying processes are. So this brings us to our study of walleye mercury in Northwestern Ontario. So this was mostly done work by Ben Wood, recent graduate from our lab, as well as Danny Gartshore, who looked more at the growth stuff, which we'll get into a bit. So here we're looking at 31 lakes. We're doing sort of taking a two-pronged approach here. One is a spatial comparison of lakes to try and ask invaded lakes versus non-invaded lakes, looking at what they look like now in terms of mercury. Is one higher than the other? And then looking at 10 lakes and the 3 bays of Rainy Lake to try and understand over time, do we see an increase in mercury concentrations once Spiny Water Flea invades? So 2 different sides of the coin in terms of trying to answer this question. So here's the Rainy Lake complex up here, and then all the lakes that are downstream of it, as well as the lakes in Quetico Provincial Park where we were asking these questions. Okay, and our metric that we're going to use for a measure of trying to understand the impact of changes or various environmental drivers on mercury concentrations in fish is this, we're going to call it a bioaccumulation slope. So the slope of the relationship between mercury concentration in the fish and the size of the fish. We know that the size of the fish is really important, so we want to build that into our models when we're trying to ask these questions. Okay, so if I wasn't boring you with graphs already, I'm really going to bore you now because this is a 3D graph. Super fancy. The important point to make here, so we've got what we ended up with on this spatial analysis was that there's 2 important variables in terms of what's driving, 3 important variables in terms of what's driving the amount of mercury in a walleye. It's the body size, which we expected. It's how big the lake is that they live in. And it's whether or not it's invaded by Spiny Water Flea or not. And where we see the biggest differences is in, so if we look at large lakes, so the important thing to compare is sort of this plane to this plane. And what we see is that in an uninvaded lake, for mercury and walleye, for small fish, it's way down here, okay? But in an invaded lake, for a small fish, it's way up here, which corresponds to a difference of about that. Okay, very large. And so where we tend to see the biggest differences in mercury concentrations in what we'll call small walleye, so less than 50 centimeters, which if you look at the consumption guidelines, that's sort of where it cuts off in a lot of cases, right? 50 centimeters, that's like 24 inches for our American folks. And then it amplifies as lake size increases. So the difference is biggest in big lakes, Rainy Lake, right? Versus small lakes where it's not as pronounced. This next slide shows us what things look like when we ask, have there been changes over time? And so these are the Quetico lakes. Let's not focus on that for today, but we will look at, this is just the Rainy Lake system. So the blue line represents the slope of the relationship between mercury concentrations in fish and body size before Bithytrophy showed up and after Bithytrophy showed up. And again, what we see is the biggest difference between before and after is in these smaller walleye, okay? So that's a 300 millimeter walleye, 30 centimeters, 40 centimeters, and then it tends to disappear once you get up to about that 50 centimeter point. Okay. So that's encouraging because we've got two different ways of looking at the same question and got more or less the same answer. We took a survey, just a spatial survey of a whole bunch of lakes and said, let's compare lakes that are invaded or not with Bithytrophies. And in that case, we said fish that are smaller than 50 centimeters tend to have elevated mercury concentrations. And we found that both from a temporal analysis as well as from a spatial analysis. Right. And I think the real take home here is that the biggest changes that we saw are in fish that are the size that anglers are likely to come home and actually eat, right? So, and I guess the way to think about this is if you were to catch a 40 centimeter walleye today versus prior to 1999, it's probably got more mercury in it because Bithytrophies have invaded the lake. Or if you're going to go and catch walleye, 40 centimeter walleye from a lake with or without Bithytrophies, based on this, I'd probably pick the lake without the Bithytrophies, the Spiny Water Flea. And I think this gets back to some of the things that we were observing from Gretchen Hansen's study. So in these Bithytrophies lakes, fish are growing slower, right? Compared to lakes where they're not invaded. And I think those slower growth rates, and this is early growth rates of fish, those slower early growth rates likely are being driven by these issues around growth efficiency, right? You have to work harder for a smaller amount of food available in the lake in order to get big, and that causes you to have higher mercury concentrations. This plot's coming out of Danny Gardshore's master's thesis. We haven't published this chapter yet, but what we see is that on balance, if we look at the size of young of year fish in non-invaded lakes versus invaded lakes, again, this is looking across a landscape of lakes, we see the same thing that Gretchen Hansen and their group did for Minnesota lakes. If it's an uninvaded lake, they tend to grow faster than if it's in an invaded lake. And so what Danny wanted to do in her first chapter, and this is now published, is she wanted to know can we come up with an explanation for why that's happening, okay? And so the hypothesis here is that if you're in a lake without Bithytrophies, there's lots of zooplankton to eat. If you're in a lake with Bithytrophies, these Spiny Water Flea are eating all the zooplankton, and there's less zooplankton around for walleye to eat. And so we're going to use what's called a bioenergetics model, which is just a simple mass balance to say that the growth of the fish is simply the difference between how much it eats and what its metabolic costs are, right? I'm sure that several of us aging in the audience can appreciate that small fact about how metabolism influences your growth in one direction or another, however you like to look at it. So Jenny looked at this in 4 different lake types. She looked at Now we're looking at not just whether or not lakes are invaded, but also their trophic status. So she looked at mesotrophic lakes, so ones that happen to have quite a bit of algae growth, and oligotrophic lakes, which tend to not have a whole ton of nutrients. And then we also used sort of in our models 2 starting points for the initial size of walleye, because there's some differences in the literature as to what size you should be using there. And then the goal was to try and understand what's the outcome. So the first thing to understand is the inputs. So how much food is available for these fish. So we took a survey of several hundred lakes in Ontario and asked what's the density of 3 important prey types to walleye. And this is Daphnia, calanoid, and cyclopoid copepods, just different kinds of zooplankton, doesn't matter, right? They look a little different. But the important take home here is that if you're in a non-invaded lake, you have way more zooplankton than you do if you're in invaded lakes to eat as baby walleye, okay? So non-invaded lakes, more food. Invaded lakes, there's less food. But not only that, there's a clear interaction here with whether or not what the trophic status is, right? So there's more nutrients, you tend to have more zooplankton than if you don't. And that seems to be exacerbated in those invaded lakes. So what does that mean for our modeled walleye growth? Well, it means this. So these 2 colors just correspond to the 2 different initial sizes of walleye that we modeled. And the comparison here is if we want to say what's going on in the mesotrophic between invaded and non-invaded lakes, we see that it's, slightly smaller, but not a huge difference. What really seems to make a difference is in these oligotrophic lakes, when we don't have a whole lot of nutrients around. We either go from a fish that can get to be 38 millimeters after, 4 weeks of growth that we modeled, down to 10. Right? That's a big difference. And in this smaller starting bin, if you start them at 9 millimeters instead of 10, you can't even get the models to converge. They just die. They won't make it at all. So the real take home from this paper was that if you're in oligotrophic lakes and it's invaded by Bythotrephes, the impacts on walleye in terms of early growth are pretty exacerbated. Right, I just said that. And I guess this is the other thing to stress. If you look at sort of lakes that tend to be surveyed for where walleye occur, in Ontario anyway, most of them, just look at the presence block here, that's the orange one, or the green color here, they're mostly oligotrophic lakes. So, if we're thinking about walleye on the landscape and are they going to be susceptible to Bythotrephes invasion, it looks like most of them are. Okay. So, guess the take home for a bunch of this, I've only got 2 slides left. Thanks for your patience, is that increased mercury in walleye, especially in this sort of 300 to 500 millimeter range, or let's call that 15 to 20 some odd inches. And we especially expect to see that in large oligotrophic lakes when Spiny Water Flea invade. We not only that, but we expect that that's likely happening through a process of reduced walleye growth or growth efficiency due to competition with Bythotrephes at smaller sizes, and that amplifies mercury increases in those smaller body sizes. And not only that, it's also important. I don't think we would have seen this effect if we hadn't also thought of things like lake size, productivity, water clarity. We need to consider those other variables in order to see this pattern. Okay, so what does this mean for rainy lake walleye? So we already know Bythotrephes are in there. Let's think, okay, what's going to happen to this fishery over the next 20 years if we don't change anything necessarily? Let's just look at mercury concentrations generally as implied by consumption advisories. So if you look at the Ontario consumption advisories today, they tell you that you can eat, you can eat the most fish from the North Arm, fewer from the South Arm, and the fewest from Red Dead Bay. Okay, and these are all likely driven by mercury. It's rare to have consumption advisories on inland lakes that are anything but mercury. The Secchi depth in these bays is somewhere in the sort of 2.8 to 2.6 range. So we're on the clearer side of that 2 meter cutoff. So if things get more clear, we shouldn't expect big changes in terms of yield. If things get less clear, we might actually, so browning is sort of a big catchphrase that we have in lakes and the landscapes, lakes getting darker, we might actually expect walleye productivity to go up as it gets darker. We know we've got trophies, so they're here to stay. And early growth. Insensitive to Bithytrophes invasion, right? Because what we found, another piece of Danny's study was that when we look at large invaded versus non-invaded lakes, there's not a big difference between those two. We see the biggest difference in growth between small invaded and small non-invaded lakes. So at least in terms of early growth, large lakes like Rainy Lake seem to be less sensitive to this growth impact. So maybe suggest that Rainy Lake is, I'll just step on my soapbox here and see what you think, but Rainy Lake is reasonably well positioned to deal with ongoing environmental changes outlined here, and maybe highlights the importance of managing for aspects that can be controlled, things like harvest, preventing additional invasions, like we can't really do anything about the truckers once they're here. Like we can't drive around with a big net and try and scoop them all up. That's not going to be very effective. So we're only left with certain behaviors that we can deal with, and that's through harvest and preventing other stuff from showing up. But on balance, it looks like Rainy is probably in fairly good shape. And so here's some acknowledgements for folks. I guess I should thank specifically the Rainy Lakes Fisheries Charity Trust for funding to help make this project possible. Thank you, Daryl. And any questions?
You go back 2 slides.
I can, yeah.
You might have to repeat the question.
Yeah, so I'm going to make sure that I restate the question so that the people online know what's being asked. Go ahead.
So I see at the very bottom the additional invasions. Are you saying additional Spiny Water Flea to make it? It's here. It's here. Are you talking about some other species that we don't even know what it is yet that could throw the whole model off?
Yeah, no. So this is so I presented a slide earlier where I just showed you like growth rates are slower in invaded lakes. This is the nuance to that model in that it really actually also seems to depend on lake size. So if you're in a large lake, at least statistically, there's no difference between your end of season body size, okay? Like this bar extends quite a bit further up. We're sort of limited by sample size here. Like we just don't have as many large lakes as we want to be able to answer that question. We have way more smaller lakes in that data set. And here, there is a statistical difference between the end of year body size in invaded versus uninvaded lakes. And I think, I think this is driving that overall statistical pattern. There's a suggestion that there might be something going on here, but we just don't have the sample sizes to deal with it. Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Who's in charge? I'm talking about Ontario.
Yeah.
Who's in charge of keeping an eye on the Rainy Lake wall? I know Daryl was. That's great. But who's in charge now?
Okay, so the question is in Ontario, who's in charge of keeping track of Rainy Lake walleye?
Taking your results, saying, "Oh, we got to do something.
Yeah.
We got to I don't know, we gotta change the slot size, I don't know what it is, do something.
Sure, and incorporating sort of state of the knowledge in terms of
I just
informing management.
I remember who used to do it in the 70s,
Yeah.
but I don't know who does it now.
So the best way to answer that is that it's still the responsibility of the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources.
So I can go down to Scott's Feet and I can go in and I can say, I'm not a concern.
Yeah, so if you have concerns about the walleye status in Rainy River, you do have a district office here that you can go and bang on their door and let them know what you think's going on. There are people that are tasked with this process. There have been changes recently in terms of how that data is collected, who's collecting the data, and who works it up. The who works it up has been more centralized now than it used to be. So the folks in the district office here, yeah, and other sort of hubs of district works as well. Thunder Bay.
Okay.
So anyway, so there have been some changes, but it is still being monitored, and the approach to fisheries management in Ontario is still to be guided by scientific evidence. So,
But you're outside of that.
I am. I have nothing to do with LR. There are a lot of them are my friends, so I don't want to give them a bad rap.
I'm just trying to figure out how to get them engaged.
Yeah, that's a good question. And actually, I've had some conversations with folks in this room about that very question too. So I think there's for sure opportunities moving forward. So yeah, I would say that, based on sort of the things that I've presented today and that I'm looking at today, and some of the information that I've seen, at least in terms of Rainy River, I don't get the sense that there's been big dramatic changes over the past 20 years here necessarily. I don't know. I don't fish on the lake, so I'm probably the wrong guy to talk to. But, I would say that of all the large lake systems that people are super worried about in terms of the state of the resource, I would say that for better or for worse, Rainy is probably not on the top of the priority list. Yeah. There are other big systems that are undergoing extremely big changes that are wrapped up in multiple stakeholder issues in terms of trying to navigate those issues that probably are taking resources away from this one. However, I think there's still good opportunities to take the data that exists and the good management information that we have on this lake to try and better communicate to the public what the state of this fishery is on this lake today. Because I don't think we've had that in a while. Yeah, front row.
The North Arm has a lot of big walleyes, and they seem to be getting bigger. But people complain, it's hard to get a slot walleye.
Yeah.
These fish are increasing in size exponentially almost. So what is the reason for that? If it isn't smelt, I heard you say something that smelt is not influencing this.
Yes. Okay. So the question is, north arm of Rainy Lake, we've got all kinds of huge walleye to the point where they're all outside the slot. You got to put them all back. Nothing's coming home for dinner. That's a good question. So what we often see. So, and a further part of that question was is this not a consequence of smelt? So what I can say about smelt is that if you look at many different lakes where smelt have invaded, we don't see, there's not a general pattern that all the fish in all of those lakes get super big. So it's got to be something other than smelt. That said, when we look at a fishery and we find that year after year, all we're catching is big fish, that's usually an indication of something to do with recruitment failure. So meaning that those big fish are having troubles producing babies that will turn into smaller fish that eventually turn into big fish. In some of the smaller lakes that I work at ELA, at the Experimental Lakes area, we see this oftentimes with lake trout, but it's largely due to cannibalism. And so we'll see the kind of most frequent age of that population increase. And then one day it goes down by about 15 years and then kind of goes up through that. So we have these very big, strong cohorts come through that system. That's a good question. What's driving that in the North Arm? I'm not sure.
It's not water clarity. Is there a difference in water clarity between the North Arm and the South Arm generally, do you think?
That's a good question. If I had to guess, so in other species where we've looked at influence of water clarity on body size, it's typically that less clear water, so darker water tends to give you bigger fish. That it's a totally different species. I don't know if that's true of the North Arm compared to the other bays in rating, but that would be my guess if I had to guess. Yeah, over here.
Another question as to water temperature, water level fluctuations in this area when the fish are spawning and they constantly monkeying around with water levels around here. And the same trouble we had on the Nipigon River where the hydrogen, after the speckled trout spawned or whatever, they dropped all the eggs just died.
Yeah.
And up in the North Arm, they have all them rivers, and everyone's got a dam everywhere. God knows they can fluctuate the levels here forever.
Yeah.
That it really, when you go fishing, it really influences what you're catching on. And then when it's so young in the year, like you say in the North Arm, there's definitely an issue with reproduction.
Yeah.
Fish they just get big. They're all big. That means so big.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the question was, and I'll paraphrase here, what's the potential role for water level fluctuations and potentially affecting population health and the kinds of fish that you're catching and that sort of stuff, I guess, when it comes to walleye. So the important thing to think about for walleye in that whole scenario is that they're spring spawners. So if it's an issue with water levels, so if it's the eggs or the young that tend to hang out in the spaces between the gravel and stuff, if it's water level fluctuation that's having those effects, you would say, okay, I'd expect a drop in water levels right around where the walleye closure is. So in sort of spring, June, sort of. I don't know if you see that on this lake or not, but that would be where those individuals are most sensitive. Once they get out of the gravel, if they can get through that stage and survive, they're basically straight up to the middle of the lake after that, feeding on zooplankton. So if it's a water level issue, then it would be tied to big fluctuations in that early springtime period. And I'm not sure, I don't know enough about the lake to know whether or not that's when you see big changes in water levels, like especially drawdown. So, yeah, question.
Yeah, Spiny Water Flea. I mean, is there any metrics for that thing, or any like when the invasions occur and then the ecosystem adapts?
Yeah.
Does something eat it?
Sure. So the question is, what eats Spiny Water Flea? Lots of stuff. And so the thing about the life history of Spiny Water Flea that I didn't tell you is that their abundance is really flashy in the lake. Okay, so they'll be at very, very low densities or not really absent. Will hit sort of midsummer to late summer, and they go through the roof. I've been on sites on Lake Simcoe in like late August where you get up to the beach there and it looks like, flotsam and just weird stuff washing up from the waves. And it's just piles of Bithtrephes all along the lakeshore. And so they have really big impacts on the ecosystem when they're that abundant. And if you sample fish, they're all jam-packed with them. They're absolutely full. Plus, they have clump distribution, so that makes it easy for fish to find them and eat them too. But the impacts that they have on the zooplankton in the ecosystem extend beyond when they're really abundant. So in that springtime period where we're looking at walleye, that's when they really need those zooplankton to be around. Because of the impacts that the Bithtrephes have had on the zooplankton population earlier, like in the previous season, we're seeing fewer zooplankton in the following spring. So yes, things love to eat Bithtrephes when they're around, but it's almost an issue of when they're really abundant in the year, there's too many of them for things to really effectively eat. There have been cases of failed invasions of Bithtrephes, and I think it's likely to due to predation or things just being hammered down before they can get to that sort of like escaping sort of predation pressure. But that's, yeah, like everybody loves to eat them, but they're so abundant when they are abundant that you just can't. There'd be no way to mow them down entirely. So, yeah, go ahead.
I have a question. I think I have most of this. I think I understand what you're saying. We got a slide where you show big walleye eating 2 medium-sized
Oh, yeah. Growth
fish,
fish. Yeah.
little walleye eating 4 perch.
Yeah.
And like the 4 perch have the same amount of mercury
As
as the 2 Cisco.
Yeah.
2 would be, right?
Yeah. Here we go. Yeah.
Why did you put that in there? Why?
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe.
Connects the dot. What you said. I'm just trying to think about it.
Okay. So how does this connect dots? So let me see if I can do this effectively. So if okay, let me put it this way. We're gonna go, let's say we're going out for dinner after this, right? And I'm like, okay, you have the choice of eating 2 huge steaks or 8,000 chickpeas. And the 2 steaks and the 8,000 chickpeas are all spread out in the yard back here. You gotta find them, right? Arguably, you're gonna spend less time and effort picking up those 2 big steaks, and the amount of energy you get out of that because you spend less time looking for them is going to be a lot lower. Whereas, oh my God, chickpea number 4,657, and here we go. So, and both of those diet items might have the same amount of contaminants, but because you're spending so much more energy to get these guys, okay, so go back to that equation where the amount of growth you put on is the amount of food you consume minus how much energy you spend getting it, okay? You're spending way more energy getting the same amount of food in this case than compared to up here. You have the same amount of contaminants, and so if the same amount of contaminants go into these fish, this one being able to grow less versus this one being able to grow more, you actually end up with fewer contaminants than this one. Okay, so where does this fit into the big picture? So going back to the early walleye growth stuff, when we look at lakes where walleye growth in lakes that are invaded with trophies, we see that those growth rates are slower. Okay, we also see that when we look at mercury concentrations in walleye on the landscape, it's smaller walleye sizes that tend to be more contaminated in these trophies lakes. So I'm trying to present this growth and growth efficiency and how hard you have to work as your food for a potential explanation for why we only see elevated mercury in those smaller fish in these invaded systems. Like otherwise, you'd expect the big ones to be super elevated too, but we don't see that, right? And I think it's because when you get to be a big walleye, you can take advantage of those bigger prey items. Okay. Now all of a sudden, even though there's more mercury potentially in those bigger items, you grow a lot easier, right? You don't have to put as much work into getting those diet items. So it's presented, and sorry I didn't do a great job explaining that initially, but it's really presented as a way of explaining why we only see elevated mercury in the smaller walleye in our systems. Questions about that?
So the 2 yellow arrows equal same amount of mercury, correct?
Same amount of mercury. So
if I could same amount of mercury is going into both of those fish.
yeah,
But you just said the smaller fish has more mercury in it.
that's right.
That's where I think you're losing per pound.
Yeah.
Exactly for unit mass.
Yeah.
So this is a concentration.
Yes.
Okay.
This is the concentration. The total. You're right. The total amount of mercury is the same in the 2 fish, but the amount of mercury per gram is much higher in this fish than it is in this fish.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Good point of clarification. So I know concentrations. Honestly, it'd be a challenge to listen. Any other questions?